the soft embrace of comfort, is the silent killer of empires. In the grand calculus of history, civilizations that possess an abundance of easy calories inevitably grow fat, slow, and complacent. They build walls to protect their grain, believing that bread is the foundation of order. But true power is not born in the golden fields of plenty. It is forged in the icy crucible of starvation. When the soil refuses to yield and the wheat withers in the frost, man does not simply die. He adapts. He transforms from a farmer into a predator. To understand the terrifying efficiency of the Viking Age, you must look past their axes and longships. You must look into their stomachs. The secret to their dominance was not just martial prowess. It was metabolic superiority born of necessity. This is the story of how the absence of bread created the most feared conquerors of the medieval world. In the 10th century, the climate of Scandinavia was a jealous god. The growing seasons were short, brutal, and unpredictable. While the serfs of France and England were tethered to their fields, relying on a fragile monoculture of wheat and rye, the Norsemen faced a different reality. Agriculture in the high north was a gamble that the gods often won. A single early frost could annihilate a year of labor, turning grain into black rot. For the southern European, the failure of bread meant death. For the Northmen, it meant a shift in strategy. They did not starve when the granaries were empty. They simply looked to sources of energy that required blood rather than rain. When the heavy, dark rye bread was unavailable, the Viking diet shifted to a nutritional profile that modern biohackers would recognize as a tool for cognitive and physical optimization. They replaced the dull, insulin-spiking carbohydrates of the peasantry with the dense, long-burning fuel of fat and protein. This was not a dietary preference. It was geopolitical leverage. A man fueled by cheap grain is docile, lethargic, and bound to the land. A man fueled by meat and dairy is volatile, aggressive, and mobile. The lack of bread liberated the Viking from the soil. It forced him to become a master of the hunt and the herd. The primary engine of this machine was the ocean. While the Christians prayed for their daily bread, the pagans pulled their sustenance from the cold depths. Herring, cod, and haddock were not merely food. They were strategic assets. But the true genius lay in how they processed this resource. Fresh fish rots in days, limiting the range of any army. The Vikings mastered the art of dehydration. They created stockfish. By air-drying cod in the freezing winds, they removed the water while retaining the protein. This turned perishable food into a durable, lightweight energy brick that could last for years. This was the jet fuel of the Viking expansion. It allowed them to cross the Atlantic and besiege Paris without being tethered to supply lines. On land, the absence of grain forced a heavy reliance on dairy, but not in the liquid form that spoils within hours. They engineered Skyr, a fermented, strained yogurt that is almost pure protein. In the long, dark winters where sunlight was a memory, barrels of acidic, preserved dairy kept the population alive and muscular. This creates a terrifying physiological difference on the battlefield. Imagine a clash between a levied peasant, malnourished and bloated on weak gruel, standing against a warrior raised on the nutrient-dense flesh of seal, whale, and fermented dairy. It is not a fight. It is a slaughter. The biology of the North was weaponized by the very scarcity that tried to kill it. There were times when even the livestock could not be spared. In the deepest famine years of the 10th century, when the snows buried the pastures, the Norsemen turned to the wild. They ate what the forest provided, but they did not graze like sheep. They consumed the bitter, vitamin-rich greens that others ignored. Angelica, wild garlic, and stinging nettles provided the micronutrients necessary to ward off scurvy, a plague that decimated other navies. But more importantly, they hunted reindeer, elk, and bear. This reinforced the psychological archetype of the apex predator. You become what you consume. When you survive by outsmarting and killing the strongest beasts in the forest, the transition to raiding a monastery is seamless. We must also analyze the socio-political function of the feast. In a bread-scarce society, the distribution of meat becomes the ultimate currency of power. A jarl did not buy loyalty with gold alone. He bought it with the promise of the slaughter. The feast was a display of caloric excess in a world of deprivation. To sit at the high table and consume roasted pork and horse meat was to affirm one's place in the hierarchy of violence. The scarcity of grain made the communal consumption of flesh a religious experience. It bound the war band together in a blood pact. They were wolves sharing a kill, and this bond is stronger than any written contract of the civilized South. Consider the geopolitical implications of their flatbreads when grain was actually available. Even when they had flour, they did not bake soft, airy loaves that went stale in a day. They baked flat, hardtack, crisp bread. This was food designed for logistics, not pleasure. It was durable. It was portable. Every aspect of their culinary culture was optimized for movement and warfare. The soft, leavened bread of Rome and her successors was a symbol of a sedentary life. The hard, unleavened bread of the North was the ration of the explorer. It is a stark reminder that luxury is often the precursor to defeat. The ultimate dark truth of the Viking diet is that their hunger was their greatest weapon. The civilizations they terrorized were trapped by their own abundance. The Franks and the Saxons had too much to lose. Their fields, their mills, and their bakeries were static targets. The Vikings, accustomed to the lack of bread, had nothing to defend but their ships and their lives. This made them asymmetrical threats. They could burn the crops of England and starve the population, while they themselves subsisted on the dried fish and stolen cattle they carried with them. They weaponized the very starvation they had escaped. This dynamic creates a cycle of predation. When the bread failed in Scandinavia, the raids increased. The hunger of the North translated directly into the burning of the South. It is a grim lesson in historical mechanics. The calorie deficit of one region becomes the security crisis of another. The Viking did not view the monastery as a holy site. He viewed it as a pantry. The monks were merely obstacles between the predator and his prey. This ruthless pragmatism is the core of Machiavellian survival. Morality is a luxury for those with full bellies. As the 10th century progressed, this dietary resilience allowed the Norse to settle in places where traditional European agriculture was impossible. Iceland, Greenland, the Faroes. These were rocks in the ocean, incapable of sustaining the wheat fields of the mainland. Yet the Vikings thrived there because they did not need bread to build a civilization. They transferred their reliance to the sea and the herd completely. They proved that the model of the settled, grain-eating society was not the only path to power. They built a maritime empire on a foundation of protein and hostility. In the end, the Viking Age faded not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were seduced by the very bread they once did without. As they converted to Christianity and settled in the rich lands of Normandy and England, they adopted the diet of the conquered. They began to farm. They began to eat the soft bread of peace. And in doing so, they lost the jagged edge that made them dangerous. They became the establishment. They traded the metabolic fire of the wolf for the sluggish comfort of the livestock. There is a lesson here for the modern observer. We live in an era of unprecedented caloric abundance. We are drowning in the cheap, sugary equivalent of the serf's bread. We are comfortable, sedentary, and easily controlled. We have forgotten the clarity that comes from hunger. We have forgotten the strength that comes from deprivation. The Vikings conquered the world because they were hard, and they were hard because their world gave them nothing. If you wish to understand the mechanics of power, look to your own plate. Are you fueling a conqueror, or are you feeding a victim? The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, when the winter comes, and the supply lines shatter, the bread will be the first thing to disappear. Only those who can hunt will survive the long night.